Welcome to the HazMat Files, where we explore the critical moments that shape emergency response and disaster management. Today, we are tackling one of the most dangerous and unpredictable challenges that carriers, emergency response contractors, and the chemical industry encounter: global chemical incidents. Global chemical incidents often occur at ports, airports, or major trade routes where hazardous materials are being transported in large quantities. A single spill or leak can involve massive amounts of chemicals, putting large numbers of responders in harm's way, and requiring significant coordination between international teams. But here's the problem. Each country has its own regulations, different levels of training, and worse yet, no one speaks the same language when it comes to chemical response. So what happens next? Who ensures that the first on the scene are safe and equipped to handle the unknown? If you're ready for a deep dive into the world of global chemical response, stay with us. This is one episode you won't want to miss. Before we get started, a quick note: the views and opinions shared in this podcast are those of the host and guests, and do not necessarily reflect those of TransCare or its sponsoring organizations. The information provided is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as legal or professional advice. Today, we're fortunate to have with us Aaron Montgomery. Aaron proudly leads URAE as its CEO and president. His expertise has garnered international recognition with appearances and interviews on platforms such as the BBC and Global Business Report. Aaron's journey began as an environmental technician before steadily climbing the industry ladder to roles of increasing responsibility, including supervisor, project manager, and director. In 2011, fueled by a deep understanding of industry needs and a commitment to excellence, he founded URAE to fill critical service gaps and elevate industry standards. URAE has a headquarters in Denver, Colorado, and Singapore, and a network of strategically positioned offices worldwide. They specialize in emergency response, transloading, certified rail tank car repairs, and bespoke chemical services. Aaron's vision and leadership continue to drive the mission of delivering unparalleled support to the chemical industry worldwide, ensuring environmental safety and regulatory compliance. Chemicals don't respect borders, and as hazardous materials are transported around the world, the threat of international chemical emergencies is growing. From regulatory hurdles to the risks on the ground, responders face a wide range of challenges when these incidents occur. Aaron, thank you for joining us. To kick things off, could you briefly explain what a global chemical response looks like, and how is this different from U.S.-based responses?
Yeah, sure. Appreciate you having me. When you talk about global chemical response or international response, it really has a lot of meanings depending on where you're coming from. So here in the U.S., as a U.S.-based company, we have locations other places in the world, but generally we're talking about responding to locations outside of your home country or corporate country's border. For incidents like that, the complexity multiplies many times. When you're talking about response within a corporate border or within, say, the United States, for most of your listeners, I believe, you're at least working with a similar series of regulations. So we have the overarching U.S. regulations that lead response, lead safety, and compliance. Even though each individual state can have an elevated series of requirements, you're at least working with a common sense of knowledge. And generally, you're working with a first responder group or some other HazMat group that has been well-trained, has been to TransCare events, or has been trained on ICS protocols and different things like that. Outside of the U.S., you don't run into that near as often. You have a very broad mix of regulations, cultures, languages, expectations. So working through that framework and establishing that framework, especially for larger responses, can be quite complicated.
From your experience, what are the most unusual challenges you have encountered when coordinating chemical response efforts internationally? And how does the country's culture and the language barriers that you mentioned impact the incident?
For unusual responses, it seems like every time we get pulled into a response in another country, it's very unusual. They don't usually call somebody like us in for small, low hazard commodities. It's usually toxic by inhalation or some kind of issues, problems that are very difficult to solve, or the product is very hazardous. And then couple that with working through language barriers and cultural barriers can be very difficult. It's ideal to have somebody in the country or speaks the language or understands the culture that's a part of your team. And that person can help lead the translation, and not just the verbal translation of the languages, but also how to understand physical cues. In a lot of countries, you'll get into what I call the culture of yes, where they just, did you understand? Yes. Do you agree? Yes. In a real hazmat incident, if somebody disagrees, they need to speak up. They need to say, hey, I look at this a different way. I see a hazard, you don't. So you really need to identify the hazards, work with your team to make sure that everybody has a similar understanding of the hazards before you proceed.
You mentioned a great point there about really giving everyone the power to stop the work or speak up if they notice something that others haven't. Something else that you mentioned is one of the biggest hurdles in global chemical response is the variety of regulations and standards from country to country. How does that typically impact how you operate in the field?
Sure. We like to export our U.S. standards to any project, but it's important to identify and understand local regulations to the extent that there may be 100 regulations that apply to this incident. The U.S. may cover 99 of them in the most strict way, but there's still one that is covered locally in a more strict way. And how do you identify those? How do you prepare for activities for potential exposure to that regulation? And you do that by understanding where to find the regulations, doing your research as you lead into any project. And it's a little easier to do when they're scheduled or multiple days out. But in a true emergency response, you really have to bring in a local person or some kind of safety oversight for that. And if it's at a chemical plant, you'll have chemical plant personnel there that can help assist with those things. But if it's out on a transportation incident at a port, you really have to do everything you can to tick those boxes. And in a true emergency response, the ultimate goal is safety, and then the environment, the pair. That's pretty universal. The ultimate goal is to limit that exposure, limit your liability, both for yourself and for your customers, and conduct that work safely.
Throughout your career, what are the most significant global chemical response incidents which you have dealt with? And what would be your top takeaways from responding to and managing these incidents?
We've done a fair amount of work abroad. Difficult to pick a top three. We just completed this year a long-term project where we were neutralizing some phosgene emitting material in the Philippines. And that project lasted over multiple years, including the construction of a reaction vessel, scrubbing system. All that was designed and built in the U.S. and exported. And then we had people mobilized to the country and do that work. The lessons learned, I think, are obviously around safety and cultural expectations. How can we work with local staff to make sure that we're safe, that they're safe? Maybe we have to provide training for them to get them to an efficient level so that we can work together, and then working efficiently throughout the process.
With global incidents, you and your team, as mentioned, could encounter difficulties communicating with local authorities, specialists, or even product labeling due to different languages. Miscommunication can slow down response times and lead to critical mistakes in assessing chemical hazards. What are the ways that you and your team have overcome these obstacles?
Getting back to your original question about difference between international response and U.S. response, is in the U.S., and many times a team like us, for larger incidents especially, are coming in and we are just one part of that ICS protocol. So we're not incident command. Typically, we're a tool, right? We're the guys that put on the suits and go in with a hammer or whatever the case may be. In international responses, many times we're forced to be that lead. And again, I'm oversimplifying because I guess in my mind, I'm thinking large parts of the Asia Pacific region, places like Africa, many places in South America, where they don't have the framework. There are countries outside of the US, outside of Singapore and the UK that have proper frameworks that we work within. But in these other regions, we're kind of the experts, which I hate that term, but we're forced to go in, take the lead, take that incident command role to a degree, working with local authorities. But then, as I said before, providing the training on the product or products, providing that training on personal protective equipment to varying degrees, and how do we protect each other and how do we protect the environment, and then charging forward together.
Having that framework and an understanding is critical during incidents. And one thing here in the US is first responders have access to a wealth of information and resources straight from their mobile phone, whether it's the Ask Rail app, Rail Crossing, or the ERG. But during international chemical incidents, some first responders may lack real-time access to critical information, such as what chemical is involved, their toxicity levels, or the best methods of containment. Without immediate information, they are at a higher risk of misjudging the situation and suffering harmful effects. Do you find that first responders are often dealing with similar issues across the globe?
Yeah, for sure. Everybody has the safety data sheet. It's pretty easy to get. You call Chemtrec. That loop can get closed pretty quickly. It's then about how to ask the right questions beyond that, because sometimes the safety data sheets are good and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they miscommunicate the hazard, that you're looking at one hazard that says, hey, this is really reactive, but the real risk is the toxicity. And how to then take that information and then say, well, this material's fairly hazardous. Does it have a product safe handling guide? And can we get that? Do we know anybody at the facility that manufactures this that's willing to have a conversation about that? And then what are the vapor pressures? If it gets out, is it going to chase me down the road? Right?
Right.
All those factors, you do have to train on the front end. That's one thing I think that TransCare does a great job of, is that front end training to limit your liability, but to reduce uncertainty is important. And then how do you take that information that you've collected and act?
With responders abroad, how does their lack of information or access to information impact the speed and safety of the response?
I'll also say a lot of these safety data sheets are produced in English. So sometimes the translation process, and usually you don't see this with large chemical manufacturers that have that safety data sheet requirement, but maybe a smaller chemical producer or broker that is moving 90 or 99.8% of their stuff in the United States, and then sales guy sells something in a different country and they just start shipping there without going back and looking at that safety data sheet. And then whenever you're collecting all the information I discussed earlier and then acting, like that all takes time. And that's not fair to your responders. It's not fair to the people on site, but it's the only way to conduct a safe response.
Absolutely. And I know earlier you mentioned logistics and how some things had been built in the US and shipped over to the country. The equipment necessary for proper chemical incident response, such as personal protective equipment, detection tools, and containment systems, may not be readily available or standardized globally. This can leave responders and response contractors vulnerable to exposure if they do not have the right tools to handle a specific chemical safely. How difficult is it to get the right equipment and materials on site when chemical incidents occur in various parts of the world?
Yeah, this is the magic of international response a little bit. It's what can I get away with flying commercial? What can I get away with flying private, which is a whole nother issue when it comes to approvals and things like that. I've flown with Halar coated Stinger in a gun case before to get it into a country. We've flown with hoses. SCBA bottles are notoriously hard to fly with. You can remove the valve so that they can be inspected, but then you got to get the valve back in it. Luckily, there's scuba diving shops in a lot of places, so you can go get them refilled at scuba shops. If you're a Scott company or MSA company and you can take your own rig and respirator, but they have bottles there for you to use. It's all the kind of tricks, and you'd be surprised what you can do with checking 4 bags each and flying into a place. But if it becomes the next step beyond that, flying with cargo airplanes into countries, the tariff requirements, the duties, the approval process, and then you have different kinds of equipment, like some high-end thermal cameras that technically aren't allowed to move because of global restrictions, because they're military applications. It's an incredibly complicated process that as you start pulling the thread, you can find out it's a very big ball of yarn. So you try to identify partners in the region, in the country, that you can partner with and pull resources from and find out what they have, either in real time or ahead of time is ideal. And then, okay, you have this, I can bring this, we'll meet there and do the best we can with what we have, as long as it's in a safe way.
A lot goes into getting ready to respond to the incident. And I understand probably every incident is different and the time it takes and the equipment you need. But on average, once you get an emergency call in another country, how long would you say it takes you and your team to get ready, to get the 4 bags packed and at least the initial steps completed in order to board that flight?
I mean, it could be pretty quick. It just depends. I've gotten the call and flown international and done work within 4 hours, been more or less on site within a few hours. But that's a pretty easy project. I can carry, in that particular incident, I took some non-sparking tools, took my respirator, my go bag, we call them go bags, are ready all the time. You could just go. But as soon as you start adding different fittings, requirements for protective equipment, transfer equipment, the process can get quite long. Luckily, most of the time we get called because the containers arrived at the customer site, it leaks when it's being offloaded, and we need you to do a valve change on it. It's not leaking when it's sitting still, right? We do that. Or the valve doesn't open. I'm working a project right now where the valve is put together improperly and the inner valve, just the handle's not actuating the inner valve. So we've got to work around the process there of how do we get that tank unloaded. But then again, sometimes very large incidents, it's about getting that first person on site or first couple of people on site to start setting up that incident command structure, start sifting through what has happened, what needs to happen next, what additional equipment is needed. Then again, what can be sourced locally, what has to be brought in from outside the region.
As we've discussed in a global context, transporting specialized response teams, equipment, or chemical neutralizers can be delayed due to distance, customs clearance, tariffs, or infrastructure issues. First responders in other countries may have to work with limited resources or wait for international aid, which can prolong exposure risks. Have you seen cases where responders had to wait for specialized teams to arrive due to a lack of local expertise or equipment? And how did that impact the incident?
Yeah, we see that fairly regularly. As with the impact, you're really up against if the product is actively leaking, then the delay is obviously allowing more product to release, more product to enter the environment, perhaps impact people. So from that perspective, it's quite obvious more contamination could make the project last longer on the back end. Many times minutes on the front end mean hours on the back end, right? Hours mean days. If you're looking to clean that, release that contamination up to a standard.
I know we've mentioned some training levels and how they vary around the world and how you and your team may, as part of a response, have to provide some training. And not all countries or regions have the same level of training or resources for chemical incident response like we do in the US. First responders from other regions with less training face increased risks when responding to hazardous material incidents, while those with more advanced training may be left to take on the brunt of the response. How does this disparity affect the way chemical incidents are managed, particularly those in the chemical industry and local first responders?
Yeah, I think it affects it directly, depending on the country we're responding to. I think for the sake of this podcast, we're assuming it's a country that maybe doesn't have the preparedness that we do here. That's not always the case. I want to make sure that that's clear. But for the sake of this conversation, a lot of times it just says, hey, we can't send one person and do a level 2 consulting on the front end and say, you need to do it this way, that way. Sometimes we have to send 4, 6 people to a site and just do it ourselves, because you're not going to train somebody on a high vapor pressure, toxic by inhalation response. You're going to have people that know what they're doing, how to stop the leak, change the valve, whatever the case may be, scrub the product. You can maybe train decon people to help on the decon side, but you're not going to train them how to enter a level A suit and go in and effect a change. The biggest thing about lack of preparedness within a certain country or region is we'll just have to mobilize more personnel, more assets as we look at it from our bases, either in Peru or Singapore.
We've mentioned some challenges that are faced globally, whether it's equipment access or training knowledge or immediate access to information. Given these challenges, how can international collaboration help improve the training and preparedness of first responders worldwide?
I think it falls to the shipper as a chemical manufacturer, shipper, shipping products, especially products that go beyond the low vapor pressure acids and caustics and even go beyond propane or propane-like. In a lot of countries, there's good training, even in countries you wouldn't expect. There's good training for propane-like materials or anhydrous ammonia specifically, or those type of materials. And then your standard chemical water treatment chemistries, things like that. Beyond that, as a shipper, you're saying, I'm going to put this hazardous product, this fumigant, whatever the commodity is, this anhydrous product into this market. And am I then following up with emergency response training the customer? And we see that a lot with our customers who are those chemical manufacturer shippers, that the emergency response person may see the need, but may have trouble getting budget to do those things. Wasn't in the calculus. Every customer, every company's different, every budget's different, but it is an important step, not just for them, but you talk about responsible care principles and how do those export and how does making sure you're doing your job right affect other companies that are manufacturing a similar product. The whole reason responsible care was put into being.
Absolutely. That community engagement is critical, whether it's in the US or abroad from the shipper's end. Looking ahead, what do you believe are the most important steps the global community needs to take to improve chemical emergency response?
Looping back to what we discussed, it's training. In many cases, it's maybe equipment, supplies, stashes. And we work with a lot of monomer producers and we strategically locate short stop products, which are meant to kill reaction. So we're working with several to stage that material, even in countries maybe that don't have response capabilities. But you can't get a chemical product into a country in the amount of time it would take to respond appropriately to a polymerizing product, right? So we're pre-staging those supplies, we're pre-staging that equipment so that whenever there is an incident, or if there ever is an incident, we can respond quickly. So training, equipment, and supplies preparedness, and just understanding regulatory requirements and the capability of any local team.
Pre-planning is a critical part of that and identifying what are the gaps, where you need the equipment, where you need the resources. Are there any emerging technologies or international protocols that you're particularly excited about, which could help enhance the safety and efficiency of responding to these incidents?
We talked a little bit about pre-staging that short stop inhibitor material around. I think that's very important. We're trying to pull together other monomer producers and generate it even domestically here in the United States so that we can kill self-reacting monomers. It's very interesting to us. I mean, we find that stuff neat, but it's also very important for response and for that responsible care.
And is there any technologies that you and your team use to make your responses more safe and efficient?
The biggest ones, I think, are drone technology, especially for larger incidents. Maybe it's not exactly new or stuff, but drones and thermal cameras on drones, those types of things. Thermal cameras by themselves are very helpful. As you see, as many gases release, they release colder, so you can visually see a leak that many times you can't detect. Very important tools that I think for a lot of first responders in the US are very common, but outside the region, not so much. Because some of the more advanced ones are restricted from export, you have to find those lines that they're good enough, but not too good. Can be difficult, I think. There's also some leak detection technologies out there that use sound, which are kind of interesting. I haven't personally got a chance to play with some of that, but I know they're deploying those in chemical plants.
Aaron, we truly appreciate you sharing your insights with us today. It is evident that global chemical response is a highly complex field with substantial challenges for every organization involved. Your experience underscores the importance of stronger international coordination, more comprehensive training, and quicker access to essential resources to safeguard those on the front lines. To achieve better outcomes, first responders require continuous training in global chemical response protocols, improved international communication systems, and expedited access to tools and equipment during chemical emergencies. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
To our followers, thank you for listening. In our next episode, we will dive into the safety protocols for transporting hazardous materials by rail and discuss the challenges and solutions within the rail industry. Joining us will be HazMat managers from the Class 1 railroads operating across North America. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on the HazMat Files.